Hello, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's 10th webinar. This is our 10th HR webinar of the Total HR series, and it is Managing Mental Health at Work. Now, this actually received 70% of the poll that we did, of the vote, so obviously a very relevant and important topic to you all. My name is Karen Penfold. I'm the head of HR for Code, probably spoken to you at different points. I'm just going to start with the aims and objectives for today's session. So just run through these. This is to increase understanding of how to manage mental health issues in the workplace, therefore reducing costs and complying with employment legislation. Some of the objectives today, we're going to discuss an overview of the law relating to disability discrimination and to highlight the risks of failing to support employees suffering with mental health problems. We're also going to explore how Total HR provides some useful policies and template letters to help practices comply with their legal obligations. So the learning outcomes for the webinar, we are looking to avoid potentially costly mistakes related to disability discrimination and to improve your understanding of the benefits of really promoting employee well-being, to understand the legislation related to managing employee mental health problems. Okay, so this is quite a meaty topic and quite a challenge to get into a session today as a webinar, as essentially it's not black and white. We are talking about human beings and there's not one size fits all. So there's no set procedure on how to look after them and manage mental health in the workplace. It is so essentially for the content today, we're going to look at what your responsibilities are as employers. Also, what do we mean by when we say mental health or mental well-being? Look at some common forms and some more severe types as well, and look at how we can proactively reduce the effect of mental health illness on the workplace, particularly looking at work-related stress, and some support tools there and some advice and guidance that might help you in supporting your team members going through that. Also, it's looking at how we can minimise the risks. Unfortunately, mental health and mental illness generally still has quite a stigma attached to it, and a lot of employers are not managing it. And we're going to look at what's that costing you in terms of a financial cost, but also the impact on your business as a whole. Okay. So what do we mean when we talk about mental health? Now, this is how the World Health Organization actually describe it. They say it's a state of well-being in which every individual realizes his or her own potential and can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively and fruitfully, and is able to make a contribution to her or his community. So it's quite a statement, but I think it's a really good description of what we mean by well-being, mental well-being. And there is, because there's so much in the news about mental health, it's very much on the agenda. There is perhaps a perception at the moment that mental health itself, mental health problems are increasing in society. However, there isn't a significant increase. It tends to be actually the research is showing that the real problem is how people are coping with mental health issues day to day now. And that tends to be, we know there's a lot more awareness about it, so people hopefully are starting to talk, but the increase is being seen in suicidal feelings, self-harm, and that's where the real concern is, but also looking at how it's affecting businesses and the economy as a whole. So if we can just pause and look at some quite strong statistics here. I mentioned what it's costing the economy. This is actually an independent review that was carried out in 2017. And these statistics are related to employers and what the cost of mental health illness that's in the workplace, and absenteeism of £8 billion. This is per annum. And when we're looking at presenteeism costs, £17 to £26 billion. When we talk about presenteeism, it essentially means that people who are coming into work when they are not well and therefore perhaps being less productive or making mistakes and errors or making themselves worse and then leading into going off long-term sick. Also, staff turnover, £8 billion per annum. And that's because statistics show something like 79% of people with who go off sick at work with work-related stress or mental health problems tend to not ever return back to work. That's quite a huge number. So therefore, that's why you have such a high cost there. Breaking this down to what it's actually costing you as an employer is between £1,200 and £1,500 a year per employee by not managing mental health or mental health illness related at work. So it's a huge amount. So let's just look at now employers' responsibilities. Where do you stand? What are you meant to be doing with looking after your team members? Now, under the Equality Act 2010, and we have talked a lot about the Equality Act throughout the different webinars that we've done, which is mainly the fact that disability discrimination is a protected characteristic, and therefore somebody who has a physical or mental impairment is protected under this piece of legislation. So you should be protecting your team members from being treated unfairly or put at a detriment because they may have a mental health illness. Now, this could be an illness that is substantial and has been going on for some time, tends to be over 12 months, but is having a really strong adverse effect on their day-to-day life and ability to carry out normal activities. So therefore, your duty is also to cover reasonable adjustments, provide reasonable adjustments for your employees who are suffering with a mental health illness or condition. Now, previously, we have a webinar Sophie actually did recently. I would recommend having a look at that. It's all about reasonable adjustments, and it will give you some really good understanding and idea of what systems and adjustments you can put in place for those employees. Also, maybe this is something that people are not probably less aware of. Under the health and safety legislation, employers also have a responsibility for the health and well-being, the mental well-being of their team members. Now, that is to make sure that they're not impacted by stress at work. And there is a duty there to assess the types of stress that your team members are coming up against. And that can be in the form of a risk assessment. It's a much more proactive approach now. With iComply, we have a general risk assessment, which we are updating and will be sending out shortly, that actually includes stress in an area there for you to assess against that. Okay. So let's think about some of the common conditions or mental health illnesses that we come across. And I have sort of based this, it's not in any particular order, but it is essentially the ones that we talk to our members about on the phone who are trying to support team members going through these issues. Now, depression, and this can be something that you may see on a fit note that said low mood, low self-esteem. Anxiety and panic attacks, those types of conditions. Now, these top three here are all related very much so to work-related stress, which I'm going to talk about later. Also, OCD is another one that comes up quite often. People with phobias, and it actually affect them being able to go about their day-to-day life or come into work. And you may have come across SAD, which is seasonal affective disorder. This is particularly in the winter months that we've recently had when it's particularly dark, and people do actually get quite depressed and into a low mood there. There are also, I'd say, other common areas that we come across is postnatal depression is quite a big one. We also PTSD, which is post-traumatic stress disorder. There can be personality disorders, eating disorders. There are so many different types, and people shouldn't really be labelled as essentially you could have a person, an individual that is suffering with several of these at any one time. It could be a temporary condition that is a reaction to something they're going through in their life at that period of time, and not necessarily a long-term ongoing situation. So let's look at some more severe forms. Now, this bipolar disorder you may have come across, schizophrenia, there's also psychosis and clinical depression, which is far more serious. These types of severe forms tend to be longer term. They require much more complex treatment. And sadly, a lot of them are linked to those suicidal feelings and self-harming. So much so, we've actually, the Public Health England have actually released a suicide toolkit for employers now, which is quite shocking when you think about it. It just shows the level of concern and what's being talked about with mental health illness at work in particular, that they've felt that that was proper to introduce that. So it's still rare in the workplace, but there is somewhere to go if you need support and help and you are concerned about an employee who may be at risk of self-harming. So let's just have a look at, and again, there's so much research out there because I think, as you've seen from the figures, the government are so concerned about how much it's costing the economy and employers as a whole. So some more statistics just to really hit home the scale of the problem. We're looking at 1 in 5 people are actually off sick due to work-related stress, which I am going to talk to you more about in a moment, break that down so you have an understanding of work-related stress is. Also, the cost, 1 in 6 workers are experiencing common mental health problems. And that is the depression, anxiety, panic attacks, those types of problems that we looked at a moment ago. And again, linked to work-related stress in a big way. 49% of workers would not feel comfortable disclosing a mental health condition or an issue at work. Now, that's the area that really the government, with all the help and working with the CIPD and charities like Mind, are trying to address to try and get employers to thinking more about how they can be proactive and make sure that they have a very open culture in their workplace to try and address this. So I've talked a lot, mentioned work-related stress linked to those different conditions. What do we actually mean by work-related stress? So the Health and Safety Executive, actually, they define this as an adverse reaction to excessive pressures or other types of demand that is put on employees and in the workplace. So stress itself is not doesn't have any medical diagnosis. It's not actually a medical condition. It's a state of mind, a state of feeling. However, if you have it ongoing, and it's the severity is what the real issue is. If somebody is experiencing work-related stress on an ongoing basis, that can lead to these mental health problems, which is what we're looking at in terms of depression, anxiety, and going off work with panic attacks, those types of conditions. Now, it's really healthy in the workplace, I think, to have a little bit of pressure and a little bit of stress, and everyone's capacity for coping with more work or pressure is different. Going back to there's not one size that fits all. However, we're going to look at some of the triggers of what you can bear in mind to try and reduce this potential impact on your employees. The biggest impacts, we've looked at the cost, is the high number of absence levels, people going off sick with work-related stress, never returning back to work or on long-term sickness, so you're having to recruit, so your staff turnover is increasing, and also presenteeism, that they might be coming into work, probably because a lot of people now only receive SSP and not getting paid sick pay, or feel embarrassed about saying their reason for being off sick. So they're coming into work when they're not well, and then you have people there potentially making errors or being less productive. So when we talk about workplace triggers, and this is really focusing what is actually causing people getting so ill and so stressed in the workplace. Now, through research, you may be surprised, may not be surprised at this, but it's actually the number one reason for people leaving their jobs or going off on long-term sick related to work-related stress is down to poor line management and the style of the line manager that works with them. Now, think about some of the examples that you may have come across in your own experiences of poor line managers that you've worked for and how that has made you feel. The things that are really common, that and it could be that they just don't have the people skills, they're busy themselves and just not had the training to realise how they're coming across. Some of the behaviours that can really affect an employee are inconsistent behaviour. So perhaps you can go up one morning and say to them, I've got a query, and they're happy to help, very approachable. And the next day you go to them at the same time and they're dismissive, telling you to go away. And it's a completely inconsistent approach to you. They could be moody, grumpy. And you may have heard quite often when you hear the sort of term, I wouldn't ask them a query today, they've got that face on. And those types of things, you're creating a manager who's incredibly unapproachable. And that can be quite cause a lot of anxiety for team members working around them. Also, if they are overly critical. So if they're constantly picking up on mistakes and it's always negative feedback that the employee is receiving, or a big mistake is actually criticising someone's work in front of other colleagues and team members, pointing out their mistakes openly, can also cause someone to feel very anxious. And again, if this is severe and ongoing and constant, that's when you're ending up with those going off with that depression and low mood in those situations. I think another one that really comes up if managers are not able to give a real there's a lack of direction there. So it could be they're very unclear on the tasks that they want you to complete. There's not a clear deadline. And therefore, then you're pulled up for not completing it. They're very vague about those instructions. All of these things can really contribute to someone feeling like they're undervalued and that they don't matter. A lot of it is engagement as well. And I was speaking to somebody recently who said that they were actually signed off work for a few weeks because of a bereavement in the family. They came back to work met with their line manager, and rather than talk to them and ask them how they were, it was straight into work mode. Nothing about how they had been coping. It was not mentioned at all, which can all contribute to the employee feeling not engaged or less motivated and not wanting to be there. So a lot of companies now, and this is again about being the proactive approach, is actually looking at recruiting line managers and training line managers to have these qualities to be a strong leadership. So they need to be approachable, supportive, collaborative, clear decision makers, and clear in what they're asking their employees to do. Also firm but fair, because you want to have that balance. You're not expecting people to be pushovers. But it's also what it's proving is that taking this approach to line management is actually starting to empower employees, and it can actually build resilience. That's the key area. You're starting to build resilience in your team and in your workforce, that they can actually start to take on more pressure. So there's so many positives in that style. So just think about that day-to-day style and some of the skills there if they need to improve their management style. So other workplace triggers now. This is contributing to people being ill with work-related stress. Another big one is working long hours. If you have a culture in the business where the expectation is that you should be coming in early, working late, working through lunches and not taking breaks. And again, this could be leading from the top, those examples. And every now and then we know we have to go above and beyond in work, and there are deadlines that come and go. It's where this is constant, going back to that severity factor. And if it's expected as well, this can make people very ill. And also on top of that is an unmanageable workload. If you haven't got enough resources, if someone feels like they're doing the work of two people, and they can't talk to their manager, if they're unapproachable, this is all heading in the direction of them ending up with going off with work-related stress. Another trigger that can actually it creates a lot of uncertainty for people is change, bad change management. Essentially, if you have an organisation that's going through a restructure, or it could be a redundancy situation, if that's not managed well, people can be, that's not communicated, you can end up with the team feeling very unsettled and uncertain and starting to become anxious and depressed about it, and which again is leading in the direction of potential for work-related stress. A lot of case law on this one is conflict in the workplace. If you have colleagues that are arguing or there's actual bullying going on, as an employer, if you're not dealing with that or managing it or sort of nipping it in the bud, having a zero tolerance approach, and an employee is coming to you asking for help and nothing is done about it, and they end up leaving, you are very much exposed there to breaches of negligence, the health and safety and legislation we talked about, but also it could turn into a constructive dismissal claim and those types of things. So it's really important to make sure that any bullying or any conflict in the workplace is managed from the get-go. Culture overall, if there's stigma, do people talk and joke about mental health problems in the workplace? Is it something that nobody mentions? Is there a sort of blame culture in the place as well? This can all contribute to that work-related stress and those pressures. So let's just have a look at some external triggers. As I said, it's not just mental health illness is not just linked to work. I mean, we've looked at some of the triggers that cause the work-related stress, which is what's costing employers so much money. But there are also external triggers, and quite often it can be a mixture of both. So I think one of the top ones that we talk to members about on the helpline quite often is people having a reaction through bereavement, losing a close relative, and that can cause some mental health, depression and illness through that. Through debt, financial worries as well. A very big one is marital problems, divorce, and those types of issues. Drugs and alcohol abuse, if that can go long term, if they're very serious in that sense, that can lead to mental health problems. And also domestic violence. Sadly, we do come across this quite often on the helpline. It may be because we work with a very female workforce in a sense. That is quite a problem in leading to mental health problems to deal with that. Also, if people have been going through childhood abuse and those things and memories are coming back, they may have a mental illness because of that as well. People with carer responsibilities, it's good if you've got employees that you're aware of that are dealing with that, you might want to check that they've got the support in place. It can be quite exhausting if everything's on their shoulders to look after perhaps an elderly relative or they're looking after a sick child. It's terms of thinking about what support they might need. Another one that we do come across quite often is people who have been off sick for a long time, maybe recovering from a serious illness, and they've then come back into work. They could have a reaction to that and really need some settling in and some extra care and support in terms so that it doesn't continue or they end up going off sick again. So let's think about what signs to look out for. So you can see the triggers, things that are related to work-related stress or in other terms of mental health and illness. Now, if you are a team that works really closely together and you know each other really well, you probably can pick up if somebody's acting out of character. What I really like, I spoke to a member the other day and he said that his ethos in the practice was to encourage his staff to look out for one another. And I think that's such a lovely way of doing it, that you're actually keeping an eye on each other, because we're all busy and quite often it doesn't mean you don't care. You just haven't picked up on the signs because you're so focused on what you're doing. So some of the signs is if you are seeing team members who are suddenly becoming withdrawn, potentially they're normally really chatty and outgoing, perhaps they've gone in withdrawal, gone very quiet and into themselves. It may be the other way, that they're very euphoric in some ways or overexcited. So sort of that extreme behaviour, getting angry about things that you wouldn't normally be angry, picking fights or conflict with other colleagues, coming in late, asking to leave early. Another signal can be if they're starting to ask for holidays at real short notice and are less motivated, disengaged with work. There are other responses is quite a big one as well. It could be that an employee that you normally talk to and able to give straightforward instructions to is suddenly hypersensitive or very tearful when you talk to them. And those can be signals that something might be wrong there. Also, appearance and body language. Now, if somebody is not taking as much self-care of themselves, someone that's normally well presented, and they're coming in, perhaps they're not as clean shaven or dishevelled, those can be signals, or not looking after their appearance. Now, it's important to note that just because if you spot any of these signs, it doesn't mean that there is actually a mental health illness in place or something wrong with them. It should send a warning signal to you that there could be something wrong, and you should be able to instigate a conversation to talk to them about how they're feeling and just make sure that they're okay. So disclosure, now this sounds very formal here. I'm not talking about DBS checks when I mention this. This is disclosure in terms of when people actually are willingly and comfortable to tell you that they have a mental health illness and are suffering in any way. Now, the biggest barrier for people actually telling their employer is around the stigma still, unfortunately. It tends to be that they're worried it will affect their career, their chances of promotion and progression, how people view them. They think that it might lose face in some way. Particular senior managers, it could be that they feel that they'll be judged or there'll be a doubt over their ability to do the job. So there's a lot of reasons why people do not come forward. There's several ways that an employee may disclose a condition to you. It could be through their medical questionnaire, if they're coming in from the start and they've disclosed a condition on there. It could be through a one-to-one conversation with them, or through reviews, or even from a fit note that is instigated. If you see something from the GP that has signed them off work with a condition, then it's a good idea to talk to them about it. Also, it may be that you're not aware of there being a problem until perhaps appraisal time, which would be quite a concern if it's taken them that once a year to actually sit down with you and tell them that they have a problem. But it's quite a scary and brave thing for them to do. The important thing is, as soon as you are aware that there is a condition or there is a problem and they've opened up to you about it, is to not ignore it. And this sounds quite obvious because a lot of this is common sense. However, we know from speaking to line managers, there is a real fear of saying the wrong thing. And sometimes it's easier to shy away from it and ignore it and hope it goes away. However, if that happens, it can quite quickly spiral out of control. So it's important to sit down and have a discussion with them. This would be confidential between yourself and the employee. And the real focus in this discussion should be not so much on the diagnosis of what they're telling you that they have with their mental illness. What you should be looking at is the impact of their mental illness on their work and how you can support them to stay in work. That's the key area here. It's working with them to say, okay, this is what the situation is. We're not an expert on what they might have been diagnosed with, but what can we do to help you stay well and stay in the workplace? There are so many different ways you can support an employee to stay in work with this. Now, as I mentioned earlier, it's not black and white, and there isn't one size fits all. But some options are to look at the reasonable adjustments, which could be flexible working, some temporary arrangements. Perhaps they need a quiet space to go. You need to, or a signal to you if they're not in a good place. Now, some arrangements between line managers and the employee, because they don't want to go into lots of detail, there will be something visual, a sign that they show them to say, I'm not in a good place right now, I need to take a break. And that can be as much the use of emojis, for example, come into that to show them I need some time out. Also, if you are aware that there is work-related stress, if an employee is coming to you and saying, I'm struggling with work and I'm stressed and I'm getting ill because of this, it's really important that you take that seriously and you sit down with them and look at conducting a stress audit. Now, this is actually to break down what the issues are in their job role and see how you can put controls in place to minimise that risk of stress. And it's really important to do that straight away and also review that with them. This is where going to get seeking advice to help you with this is really important. As again, there's so many different ways that you could go. And so I recommend getting some external HR advice, for example, to talk through how you can conduct that audit with the employee. So I mentioned earlier, it is about that proactive approach and trying to build resilience in your team so they can cope with a certain amount of pressure. And we're not expecting employers to work, you're not expected to keep an employee who is not productive and not working and not able to do their job. But fundamentally, you are expected to try and do all you can to work with them to either prevent it from happening or to keep them in the workplace and a happy employee. So the first step would really be to look at your recruitment and induction stages from the get-go, to meet with the employees and new starters that come into your workplace, is to talk to them about the culture of the practice, for example, and what's expected in terms of mental health and well-being, that you're open about this and you encourage people to talk about it. You have a very positive culture and everyone does look out for each other. Also, it's an opportunity to go through your policies and procedures and make it clear what the behaviour standards are expected. So you have a zero tolerance on bullying, for example. And, the other key part is through that induction and recruitment stage is to make it clear to them where they can go for help and support so they know that there are avenues and they're not alone. So I don't know if anyone's come across these before. They're quite another new proactive tool that has come out again with so much around mental health. There's something coming out on a weekly basis to help people and help employers. These are called Wellness Action Plans, or WAPs, abbreviated. These are fantastic tools, and you don't have to have a mental illness or mental, in place, but it's a really good idea to actually instigate these with all team members, even from the very start, from a recruitment stage. They are essentially a tool between the line manager and the employee to help them stay well in work and support them. Really recommend those, and if you want to know where you can get those, and you can let me know. Flexible working is considered a reasonable adjustment. So one of the other triggers is that work-life balance overloading, those hours that we were talking about, is to make sure from the top that people are working and taking their proper breaks. And it's not a culture in the business that you're always expected to not go on time, and consider flexible working requests when they do come through to you. So another tool that's going to be really good in helping people with mental health issues in the workplace are employee assistance programs, so EAPs. Now, these are a counselling service, a telephone counselling service, and they offer all sorts of advice through debt, marital troubles, counselling, therapy, support, and they are brilliant. They are so good, and they're accessible to all of your team members. They're also a way for perhaps managers and owners or who haven't got anyone to talk to. They've got that confidential line as well. Now, you can access these quite often. They come as part of a package with insurance. And so there's a way, so I would recommend perhaps looking into that as well. So looking at what external support you have, when we, on the HR helpline, when we talk to members about when they're trying to cope or manage with an individual who's suffering with a mental illness at work, quite often it does always involve some external support as well that they need to go to in terms of referral to their GPs, GP reports, and it's to find out what else we can do about a particular mental health condition, say if they're suffering with bipolar, schizophrenia, those types of things, and every individual is affected differently. It's really important that you get expert external support to help you with that. GP referrals, it's good to encourage an employee who is perhaps suffering with depression, low mood, and you're concerned about their well-being, is to encourage them to go and see their GP. The GPs are able to refer them to the IAPT, which is an NHS-funded scheme. It's counselling, cognitive behavioural therapy, that type of thing. There is a bit of a waiting list, but there are sort of 6 sessions that the employee will receive, and I hear very good feedback that it's actually a good way to go. A lot of companies, and again, this might be something you want to consider as part of your wellbeing plan, your wellbeing policy, would be to consider counselling and therapy, and it might be something you're willing to pay for a certain amount of sessions, but depending on what the risks are, your concerns are with that employee. There is also the Access to Work scheme, which is another government scheme, and this is to help employers keep people with disabilities in the workplace. And I do believe there's funding opportunities there as well to help with any reasonable adjustments. So I recommend having a look at that one. Occupational health as well. Now, if you do anything, try and get a really good occupational health service on board with you to help refer your employees who are particularly on long-term sick. Now, there's a bigger success rate if you have an occupational health service on board to help facilitate return to work with somebody who is off on long-term sick due to mental health issues. There are a range of mental health charities out there. I really recommend Mind, and they have one regional as well on their website, and they have several tools and things that would help you in dealing with and managing mental health in the business. Also, external HR support, seeking that advice to help you work through with individuals and making sure that you're covering and mitigating your risk to yourself as an employer. So talking about risks, I mentioned earlier, because there is no set procedure and it's not black and white, there are so many risks at different levels if you're not managing mental health in the workplace, not just about the costs, we've looked at the statistics there, but actually in terms of the high risk of disability discrimination claim, which with mental health and impairment, it tends to be coupled with personal injury claims and negligence as well through your duty to comply under health and safety legislation. Also, you're resulting in that long-term sickness and everything that's involved in trying to work with an employee on long-term sick to help facilitate the return to work. And whilst they're off, the impact on the rest of your team, if you're not replacing them and they're having to pick up the load or they're not being supported in other ways, then it could end up spiralling and you end up with more people going off on work-related sickness as well. Presenteeism, I mentioned a few times that you've got people coming into work who are not well, being less productive and making errors. The actual relationship between the employer-employee, if you're not supporting them and not building that resilience, there is a breakdown in that mutual trust and that relationship. They don't feel that they're being valued or looked after. And you will find that people will leave because of that, and that will affect your turnover figure, or you'll end up with grievances and having to deal with those. Overall, it's good to consider your own employer brand, your own reputation, and customers and patients' experience. If they're coming in and they're seeing different team members all the time, but also if they're not looking very happy in that sort of atmosphere that's created there, then it's not going to look very good for yourself as a brand. So it's something also to think about. So on iComply, I mentioned earlier, we will be releasing an updated general risk assessment, which will help you with your stress risk assessment as well. And on top of that, we have a lot of policies and templates on iComply that will help you in managing stress in the workplace. You've got your stress policies, there's a stress overview document as well. Your equality and diversity is important to read through, and also those on anti-bullying and harassment, making sure that you're instigating that zero tolerance. HR members and those, we do offer this total HR and employment law service, which in this scenario in particular, I mentioned it because it's not black and white and each individual is is completely different what they're going through. What we offer is a personal service where you will have your own HR advisor who will get to know you and look after you and be able to guide you through these tricky situations and help mitigate those risks of getting it wrong. We also provide contract setup, and we bespoke letters and policies. So it might be a wellbeing policy that you're looking to produce to help you manage mental health in the workplace. And in addition to that, you will receive a HR application, which is a fantastic application that will help you with managing sickness and all your documentation, your CPD, DBS, and all sorts of things there. If you are interested in this at all, then please give our professional services team a call and they will give you some more information. So some actions to take away for next week before we go into questions is to review your stress policy. Have a look what the culture is like in your business and what you might want to look at improving. Also to consider introducing the wellness action plans for your team, and they are a great tool. Encourage staff to discuss and seek support, be open with each other, and train your line managers if they are perhaps lacking in some of those people skills or being unapproachable. Then it's a good idea to try and build them up and give them the right training so that they can actually effectively prevent and manage the stress at work in those scenarios, and have a zero tolerance approach on bullying and harassment in the workplace. So we have some upcoming events, and I did mention earlier this was the 10th webinar in the Total HR series, but due to popular demand, I should say, we have got another webinar coming back in on the, just bear with me a second, I'm just going to move that back. On the, in about a month's time, we're going to be doing a question and answer HR webinar session, and this can be on all sorts of employment law. We will be sending out more details, so it can be on random things, and we will make sure that you know about that, so you'll be able to be invited to it. We also have our Code Compliance Update Day event in Birmingham on the 3rd of May, which is quite exciting. If you are interested in attending that event, then have a look at our website and you'll be able to register and come along. So we have so many webinars on our Code website, so please have a look at some of these. The reasonable adjustments, one I mentioned earlier, the sickness absence, they're all tied into helping you manage mental health at work as well. Now, I really hope that you have enjoyed all of the Total HR webinars in this series as much as the HR team have enjoyed presenting them. We'd like to also thank BitPod and our technical team in Brighton for helping us to deliver these as well.